The cost of electricity generated by different sources is a calculation of the cost of generating electricity at the point of connection to a load or electricity grid. It includes the initial capital, discount rate, as well as the costs of continuous operation, fuel, and maintenance. This type of calculation assists policymakers, researchers and others to guide discussions and decision-making. Cost factors. While calculating costs, several internal cost factors have to be considered. Capital costs tend to be low for fossil fuel power stations. High for wind turbines, solar PV. Very high for waste-to-energy, wave and tidal, solar thermal, and nuclear. Fuel costs, high for fossil fuel and biomass sources, low for nuclear, and zero for many renewables. Factors such as the costs of waste and different insurance costs are not included in the following: works power, own use or parasitic load, that is, the portion of generated power actually used to run the station's pumps and fans has to be allowed for. To evaluate the total cost of production of electricity, the streams of costs are converted to a net present value using the time value of money. These costs are all brought together using discounted cash flow calculations. Levelized energy cost is the price at which electricity must be generated from a specific source to break even over the lifetime of the project. It is an economic assessment of the cost of the energy generating system including all the costs over its lifetime, initial investment, operations and maintenance, cost of fuel, cost of capital, and is very useful in calculating the costs of generation from different sources. It can be defined in a single formula as where equals average lifetime levelized electricity generation cost, equals investment expenditures in the year T, equals operations and maintenance expenditures in the year T, equals fuel expenditures in the year T, equals electricity generation in the year T, equals discount rate, equals life of the system. Typically LECs are calculated over 20 to 40-year lifetimes, and are given in the units of currency per kilowatt-hour, for example AUD kilowatt-hour or EU kilowatt-hour, or per megawatt-hour, for example AUD MWh. However, care should be taken in comparing different LCOE studies and the sources of the information, as the LCOE for a given energy source is highly dependent on the assumptions, financing terms and technological deployment analyzed. In particular, assumption of capacity factor has significant impact on the calculation of LCOE. For example, solar PV may have a capacity factor as low as 10% depending on location. Thus, a key requirement for the analysis is a clear statement of the applicability of the analysis based on justified assumptions. System boundaries. When comparing LECs for alternative systems, it is very important to define the boundaries of the system and the costs that are included in it. For example, should transmissions lines and distribution systems be included in the cost? Typically only the costs of connecting the generating source into the transmission system is included as a cost of the generator. But in some cases wholesale upgrade of the grid is needed. Careful thought has to be given to whether or not these costs should be included in the cost of power. Should R&D, tax, and environmental impact studies be included? Should the costs of impacts on public health and environmental damage be included? Should the costs of government subsidies be included in the calculated LEC? Discount rate. Another key issue is the decision about the value of the discount rate. The value that is chosen for can often weigh the decision towards one option or another, so the basis for choosing the discount must clearly be carefully evaluated. See internal rate of return. A UK government study in 2011 concluded that the appropriate discount rate to analyse UK government programmes was not the actual cost of capital, but 3.5%. Marginal cost of electricity. A more telling economic assessment might be the marginal cost of electricity. This value would serve the purpose of comparing the added cost of increasing electricity generation by 1 unit from different sources of electricity generation. Avoided cost. The U.S. Energy Information Administration has cautioned that levelized costs of non-dispatchable sources such as wind or solar should be compared to the avoided energy cost rather than the levelized cost of dispatchable sources such as fossil fuels or geothermal. This is because introduction of fluctuating power sources may or may not avoid capital and maintenance costs of backup dispatchable sources. Estimates, U.S. Department of Energy estimates. The tables below list the estimated cost of electricity by source for plants entering service in 2018. The tables are from a January 2014 report of the Energy Information Administration of the U.S. Department of Energy called Levelized Cost of New Generation Resources in the Annual Energy Outlook 2014. Total system levelized cost gives the dollar cost per megawatt hour that must be charged over time in order to pay for the total cost. These calculations reflect an adjustment to account for the high level of carbon dioxide produced by coal plants. From the EIA report, a 3 percentage point increase in the cost of capital is added when evaluating investments in greenhouse gas-intensive technologies like coal-fired power and coal-to-liquids plants without carbon control and sequestration. While the 3 percentage point adjustment is somewhat arbitrary, in levelized cost terms its impact is similar to that of a $15 per metric ton of carbon dioxide emissions fee. As a result, the levelized capital costs of coal-fired plants without CCS are higher than would otherwise be expected. No tax credits or incentives are incorporated in the tables. From the EIA report, levelized cost represents the per kilowatt-hour cost of building and operating a generating plant over an assumed financial life and duty cycle. Key inputs to calculating levelized costs include overnight capital costs, fuel costs, fixed and variable operations and maintenance costs, financing costs, and an assumed utilization rate for each plant type. The availability of various incentives, including state or federal tax credits, can also impact the calculation of levelized cost. The values shown in the tables in this discussion do not incorporate any such incentives. All generating types are assumed to have the same 30-year cost recovery period, regardless of the expected lifetime of the plant. From the EIA report, the levelized cost shown for each utility-scale generation technology in the tables in this discussion are calculated based on a 30-year cost recovery period, using a real after-tax weighted average cost of capital of 6.6%. Incentives, tax credits, production mandates, etc. are discussed in the overall comprehensive EIA report, Annual Energy Outlook 2012. Photovoltaics can be used both by distributed residential or commercial users and utility-scale power plants. The costs shown are for utility-scale photovoltaic power plants. 1. Non-dispatchable. 2. Costs are expressed in terms of net AC power available to the grid for the installed capacity. O&M equals operation and maintenance. CC equals combined cycle. CCS equals carbon capture and sequestration. PV equals photovoltaics. GHG equals greenhouse gas. OpenEI database. OpenEI, sponsored jointly by the US DOE and the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, has compiled a historical cost of generation database covering a wide variety of generation sources. Because the data is open source, it may be subject to frequent revision. Germany 2013 estimates. In November 2013, a new report on Germany levelized generation costs was published by Fraunhofer. PV power plants reached LCOE between €0.078 and €0.142 per kilowatt-hour in the third quarter of 2013, depending on the type of power plant and insulation. New nuclear power is not considered as an option anymore. UK 2010 estimates. In March 2010, a new report on UK levelized generation costs was published by Parsons Brinkerhoff. It puts a range on each cost due to various uncertainties. Combined cycle gas turbines without CO2 capture are not directly comparable to the other low-carbon emission generation technologies in the PB study. The assumptions used in this study are given in the report. Divide the above figures by 10 to obtain the price in pence per kilowatt-hour. More recent UK estimates are the Mott-MacDonald study released by DECC in June 2010 and the AEROP study for DECC published in 2011. French 2011 estimates. The International Agency for the Energy and EDF have estimated for 2011 the following costs. For the nuclear power, they include the costs due to new safety investments to upgrade the French nuclear plant after the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster. The cost for those investments is estimated at 4/MWh. Concerning the solar power, the estimate at 293/MWh is for a large plant capable to produce in the range of 50 to 100 GWh located in a favorable location. For a small household plant capable to produce typically around 3 MWh, the cost is according to the location between 400 and 700/MWh. Currently, solar power is by far the most expensive renewable source to produce electricity, although increasing efficiency and longer lifespan of photovoltaic panels together with reduced production costs could make this source of energy more competitive. Analysis from different sources. A draft report of LECs used by the California Energy Commission is available. From this report, the price per MWh for a municipal energy source is shown here. Note that the above figures incorporate tax breaks for the various forms of power plants. Subsidies range from 0% to 14% to over 100%. The following table gives a selection of LECs from two major government reports from Australia. Note that these LECs do not include any cost for the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the different technologies. In 1997, the Trade Association for Wind Turbines ordered a study into the costs of electricity production in newly constructed conventional power plants from the Rhenish West for Currency-Lischen Institute for Economic Research (RWI). The RWI predicted costs of electricity production per kilowatt-hour for the basic load for the year 2010 as follows. The part of a base load represents approximately 64% of the electricity production in total. The costs of electricity production for the mid-load and peak load are considerably higher. There is a mean value for the costs of electricity production for all kinds of conventional electricity production and load profiles in 2010, which is 10.9 ACT to 11.4 ACT per kilowatt-hour. The RWI calculated this on the assumption that the costs of energy production would depend on the price development of crude oil and that the price of crude oil would be approximately $23 per barrel in 2010. In fact, the crude oil price is about $80 in the beginning of 2010. This means that the effective costs of conventional electricity production still need to be higher than estimated by the RWI in the past. The WVW takes the legislative feed-in tariff as basis for the costs of electricity production out of renewable energies because renewable power plants are economically feasible under the German law. The following figures arise for the costs of electricity production in newly constructed power plants in 2010. Other estimates. A 2010 study by the Japanese government, called the Energy White Paper, concluded the cost per kilowatt-hour was A49 yen for solar, A10 yen to A14 yen for wind, and A5 yen or A6 yen for nuclear power. Masayoshi-san, an advocate for renewable energy, however, has pointed out that the government estimates for nuclear power did not include the costs for reprocessing the fuel or disaster insurance liability. Sun estimated that if these costs were included, the cost of nuclear power was about the same as wind power. Beyond the power station terminals, or system costs, the raw costs developed from the above analysis are only part of the picture in planning and costing a large modern power grid. Other considerations are the temporal load profile, that is how load varies second to second, minute to minute, hour to hour, month to month. To meet the varying load, generally a mix of plant options is needed, and the overall cost of providing this load is then important. Wind power has poor capacity contribution, so during windless periods, some form of backup must be provided. All other forms of power generation also require backup, though to a lesser extent. To meet peak demand on a system, which only persists for a few hours per year, it is often worth using very cheap to build, but very expensive to operate plant. For example, some large grids also use load shedding coupled with diesel generators at peak or extreme conditions, the very high kilowatt-hour production cost being justified by not having to build other more expensive capacity and a reduction in the otherwise continuous and inefficient use of spinning reserve. In the case of wind energy, The additional costs in terms of increased backup and grid interconnection to allow for diversity of weather and load may be substantial. This is because wind stops blowing frequently even in large areas at once and for prolonged periods of time. Some wind advocates have argued that in the pan-European case backup costs are quite low, resulting in overall wind energy costs about the same as present-day power. However, such claims are generally considered too optimistic, except possibly for some marginal increases that, in particular circumstances, may take advantage of the existing infrastructure. The cost in the UK of connecting new offshore wind in transmission terms has been consistently put by Grid Ofcom at £15 billion by 2020. This £15 billion cost does not include the cost of any new connections to Europe, interconnectors, or a supergrid, as advocated by some. The £15 billion cost is the cost of connecting offshore wind farms by cables typically less than 12 km in length, to the UK's nearest suitable onshore connection point. There are total forecast onshore transmission costs of connecting various new UK generators by 2020, as incurred from 2010, of £4.7 billion. By comparison, when a new plant is being added to a power system or grid, the effects are quite complex. For example, when wind energy is added to a grid, it has a marginal cost associated with production of about £20 per MWh, and therefore will always offer cheaper power than fossil plant. This will tend to force the marginally most expensive plant off the system. A mid-range fossil plant, if added, will only force off those plants that are marginally more expensive. Hence very complex modeling of whose systems is required to determine the likely costs in practice of a range of power-generating plant options, or the effect of adding a given plant. The Institution of Engineers and Shipbuilders in Scotland commissioned a former Director of Operations of the British National Grid, Colin Gibson, to produce a report on generation levelized costs that for the first time would include some of the transmission costs as well as the generation costs. This was published in December 2011 and is available on the Internet. The institution seeks to encourage debate of the issue, and has taken the unusual step among compilers of such studies of publishing a spreadsheet showing its data available on the Internet. OECD NEA estimates for the United States. The estimated figures on grid-level systems costs published by the OECD Nuclear Energy Agency in 2012, have been criticized for its adequacy and used methodology. Swedish KTH in Stockholm published a reporting response, finding several question marks concerning the calculation methods. While the grid-level systems costs in the 2012 OECD NEA report is calculated to be $17.70 per MWh for 10% onshore wind in Finland, the Swedish Royal Institute of Technology concludes in their analysis that these costs are rather $0 to $3.70 per MWh, as they are either comparatively small or already included in the market. External costs of energy sources. Typically pricing of electricity from various energy sources may not include all external costs, that is, the costs indirectly borne by society as a whole as a consequence of using that energy source. These may include enabling costs, environmental impacts, usage lifespans, energy storage, recycling costs, or beyond insurance accident effects. The U.S. Energy Information Administration predicts that coal and gas are set to be continually used to deliver the majority of the world's electricity. This is expected to result in the evacuation of millions of homes in low-lying areas, and an annual cost of hundreds of billions of dollars worth of property damage. Furthermore, with a number of island nations becoming slowly submerged underwater due to rising sea levels, massive international climate litigation lawsuits against fossil fuel users are currently beginning in the International Court of Justice. An EU-funded research study known as Externi, or Externalities of Energy, undertaken over the period of 1995 to 2005 found that the cost of producing electricity from coal or oil would double over its present value, and the cost of electricity production from gas would increase by 30% if external costs such as damage to the environment and to human health, from the particulate matter, nitrogen oxides, chromium-6, river water alkalinity, mercury poisoning and arsenic emissions produced by these sources, were taken into account. It was estimated in the study that these external, downstream, fossil fuel costs amount up to 1%-2% of the Euro unregistered trademark's entire gross domestic product, and this was before the external cost of global warming from these sources was even included. Nuclear power has largely worked under an insurance framework that limits or structures accident liabilities in accordance with the Paris Convention on Nuclear Third-Party Liability, the Brussels Supplementary Convention, and the Vienna Convention on Civil Liability for Nuclear Damage, and in the U.S. the Price-Anderson Act. It is often argued that this potential shortfall in liability represents an external cost not included in the cost of nuclear electricity. However, these beyond insurance costs for worst-case scenarios are not unusual to nuclear power, as hydroelectric power plants are similarly not fully insured against a catastrophic event such as the Banqiao Dam disaster, where 11 million people lost their homes and from 30,000 to 200,000 people died, or large dam failures in general. As private insurers base dam insurance premiums on limited scenarios, major disaster insurance in this sector is likewise provided by the state. Also of note is that more modern reactors than those of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant vintage, such as the Proven Onagawa nuclear plant design, demonstrated that it can survive 13-meter-high tsunamis and safely shut down without incident, despite being the closest nuclear plant to the epicenter of the 2011 earthquake and tsunami. Photovoltaics. Photovoltaic prices have fallen from $76.67 per watt in 1977 to an estimated 36 cents per watt in 2014, for crystalline silicon solar cells. This is seen as evidence supporting Swanson's law, an observation similar to the famous Moore's law that states that solar cell prices fall 20% for every doubling of industry capacity. However, cost per watt is a poor way to compare actual life cycle costs of energy sources, as explained above. By 2011, the price of PV modules per MW had fallen by 60% since 2008, according to Bloomberg New Energy Finance estimates, putting solar power for the first time on a competitive footing with the retail price of electricity in some sunny countries. An alternative and consistent price decline figure of 75% from 2007 to 2012 has also been published, though it is unclear whether these figures are specific to the United States or generally global. The levelized cost of electricity from PV is competitive with conventional electricity sources in an expanding list of geographic regions, particularly when the time of generation is included, as electricity is worth more during the day than at night. There has been fierce competition in the supply chain, and further improvements in the levelized cost of energy for solar lie ahead, posing a growing threat to the dominance of fossil fuel generation sources in the next few years. As time progresses, renewable energy technologies generally get cheaper, while fossil fuels generally get more expensive. The less solar power costs, the more favorably it compares to conventional power, and the more attractive it becomes to utilities and energy users around the globe. Utility-scale solar power can now be delivered in California at prices well below $100 per MWh, less than most other peak generators, even those running on low-cost natural gas. Lower solar module costs also stimulate demand from consumer markets where the cost of solar compares very favorably to retail electric rates. It is now evident that, given a carbon price of $50 per ton, which would raise the price of coal-fired power by 5 carats per kilowatt-hour, solar PV, wind, and nuclear will be cost-competitive in most locations. The declining price of PV has been reflected in rapidly growing installations, totaling about 23 GW in 2011. Although some consolidation is likely in 2012, due to support cuts in the large markets of Germany and Italy, strong growth seems likely to continue for the rest of the decade. Already, by one estimate, total investment in renewables for 2011 exceeded investment in carbon-based electricity generation. In the case of self-consumption, payback time is calculated based on how much electricity is not bought from the grid. Additionally, using PV solar power to charge DC batteries, as used in plug-in hybrid electric vehicles and electric vehicles, leads to greater efficiencies, but higher costs. Traditionally, DC-generated electricity from solar PV must be converted to AC for buildings, at an average 10% loss during the conversion. An additional efficiency loss occurs in the transition back to DC for battery-driven devices and vehicles, and using various interest rates and energy price changes were calculated to find present values that range from $2,057.13 to $8,213.64. Additional cost factors. Calculations often do not include wider system costs associated with each type of plant, such as long-distance transmission connections to grids, or balancing and reserve costs. Calculations do not include externalities such as health damage by coal plants, nor the effect of CO2 emissions on the climate change, ocean acidification and eutrophication, ocean current shifts. Decommissioning costs of nuclear plants are usually not included, is therefore not full cost accounting. These types of items can be explicitly added as necessary depending on the purpose of the calculation. It has little relation to actual price of power, but assists policymakers and others to guide discussions and decision-making. These are not minor factors but very significantly affect all responsible power decisions. Comparisons of life cycle greenhouse gas emissions show coal, for instance, to be radically higher in terms of GHGs than any alternative. Accordingly, in the analysis below, carbon-captured coal is generally treated as a separate source rather than being averaged in with other coal. Other environmental concerns with electricity generation include acid rain, ocean acidification and effect of coal extraction on watersheds. Various human health concerns with electricity generation, including asthma and smog, now dominate decisions in developed nations that incur healthcare costs publicly. A Harvard University Medical School study estimates the U.S. health costs of coal alone at between $300 and $500 billion annually. While cost per kilowatt-hour of transmission varies drastically with distance, the long complex projects required to clear or even upgrade transmission routes make even attractive new supplies often uncompetitive with conservation measures, because the timing of payoff must take the transmission upgrade into account. See also: electricity pricing, comparisons of life cycle greenhouse gas emissions, distributed generation, economics of new nuclear power plants, demand response, intermittent energy source, National Grid Reserve Service, nuclear power in France, list of thermal power station failures, calculating the cost of the UK transmission network, cost per kilowatt-hour of transmission, list of countries by electricity production from renewable sources, list of U.S. states by electricity production from renewable sources, environmental concerns with electricity generation, grid parity. Further reading: Nuclear power, still not viable without subsidies. February 2011. By Doug Koplow. Union of Concerned Scientists. Levelized Cost of New Electricity Generating Technologies. Institute for Energy Research. Economic Value of U.S. Fossil Fuel Electricity Health Impacts. United States Environmental Protection Agency. The Hidden Costs of Electricity. Comparing the hidden costs of power generation fuels. Civil Society Institute. References